This world is different now. I need someone who fits it." He said it without lifting his voice. No shaking hands, no hesitation, no apology hiding between the words. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of our living room, the city lights glinting off the glass like tiny coins scattered at his feet. The evening sun had already dipped low, leaving the room washed in a cold amber glow. His phone rested loosely in his palm, still lit from the call that had changed everything. The call about the inheritance, the call about the money, the call that somehow also ended our marriage. "Welcome to my channel, my dear. I'm Mama Jo, and before I tell you what happened next, take a moment and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Every time I read your cities, it reminds me I'm not telling these stories alone. And if you're still here with me, please like this video and subscribe. It's a small thing for you, but it helps this channel survive, and it lets me keep sharing these chapters with you. Now come closer. Let me tell you what happened next. I was sitting on the edge of the sofa, my back straight, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I remember noticing the fabric of my dress, how it felt too soft for what was happening. I remember the faint smell of lemon cleaner from the morning's chores. I remember the quiet hum of the air conditioner filling the space where my voice should have been. "This world is different now," he repeated, as if the first time hadn't landed sharply enough. "I can't keep pretending otherwise." I looked at him then, really looked. The man standing in front of me wore the same face I had known for decades, but his eyes had changed. They didn't search for understanding. They didn't soften. They measured, calculated, looked past me, not at me, as if I were already a part of his past. The fortune had come suddenly, news delivered with congratulations and excitement, spoken quickly, like wealth always is. His family's luxury car showroom business, once steady but modest, had exploded in value after a buyout opportunity fell through and left the entire company in his hands. Multi-million-dollar assets, prime real estate, rows of imported cars gleaming under showroom lights, money that smelled like leather seats and polished chrome, money that came with power. And power, I learned that day, has a way of rearranging people's hearts. "I've already spoken to a lawyer," he continued, his tone calm, practiced. "The papers will be ready soon." "This doesn't have to be ugly." Ugly. The word hovered between us, strange and misplaced. I didn't ask why. I didn't ask since when. I didn't ask who. Somewhere deep inside me, a door closed quietly. Not slammed, not forced, just closed. I nodded once. That seemed to surprise him. "You understand," he said, relief slipping into his voice, as if he'd been bracing for a storm that never came. I did understand. Not because I agreed, but because I finally saw him clearly. The silence after his words was heavier than any argument could have been. It pressed against the walls, settled into the furniture, wrapped itself around my chest. Outside, a car passed on the street below, tires hissing softly against the pavement. Life moving on, indifferent. He shifted his weight, uncomfortable now. My stillness unsettled him more than tears ever would have. "You don't have to make this harder than it needs to be," he added. I almost smiled at that. Harder for whom? I stood slowly, smoothing my dress, careful not to rush. My knees didn't buckle. My hands didn't tremble. I felt clear. Pain was there, yes, but it hadn't yet found its voice. "I won't," I said quietly. He exhaled, visibly relieved. That was the moment I knew he had already rewritten our story in his mind. To him, this wasn't betrayal. It was an upgrade. Just weeks earlier, that same living room had been filled with laughter. Champagne glasses clinked, family voices overlapped. Someone had turned on music, something jazzy and celebratory. The announcement had been made with pride, with applause. "You're set for life now," his cousin had said, slapping him on the back. "Welcome to the big leagues," someone else joked. He had laughed then, standing tall, chest puffed slightly forward. I stood beside him, smiling, my hand resting lightly on his arm. I remember thinking how warm his sleeve felt under my fingers. At no point did he look at me. Not really. As the weeks passed, subtle changes crept in. New suits arrived, tailored, expensive, shoes polished to a mirror shine. His phone rang constantly. Bankers, consultants, people who spoke quickly and expected answers faster. Conversations shifted. Words like valuation, equity, expansion floated through the house like a new language. He began spending long hours at the showroom, coming home late, smelling faintly of cologne I didn't recognize. When I asked gentle questions, he waved them off. It's complicated, he said. You wouldn't get it, he added once, not unkindly, just dismissive. That was new. I noticed how his eyes lingered on women who looked effortless and sharp. Women whose heels clicked confidently against marble floors. Women who matched the world he was stepping into. I noticed how my presence seemed to slow him down, but I told myself it was temporary. Success can be overwhelming. Money can make people strange before it settles. I was wrong. Back in the living room, after he finished explaining the divorce like a business transaction, he picked up his jacket from the chair. I'll stay at the penthouse for now, he said. It's closer to the showroom. Of course it was. He paused at the door, his hand resting on the handle. For a split second, something flickered across his face. Hesitation, perhaps. Or guilt trying to find its way out. I hope you'll be reasonable about this, he said. Reasonable. I met his eyes. I've always been. He nodded, satisfied with that answer, and left. The door closed behind him with a soft click. No echo, no drama, just finality. The house felt instantly larger. Not emptier, he had been pulling away long before that, but quieter in a way that made my ears ring. I walked slowly through the rooms, touching familiar surfaces as if to reassure myself they were real. The dining table where we'd shared countless meals, the kitchen counter worn smooth from years of use, the framed photos on the wall, memories now suspended in time. In the bedroom, his side of the closet already looked sparse. He must have planned this longer than I knew. I sat on the edge of the bed and let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Still, no tears. Instead, a strange calm settled over me, a protective kind of numbness that wrapped itself around my heart like a blanket. That night, I slept alone for the first time in decades. The sheets were cool. The room smelled faintly of lavender and something else. Absence, maybe. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the tick of the clock on the dresser. Each second felt deliberate. I thought about all the years I had stood beside him when the world felt small. All the times I had believed in him before anyone else did. How easily that loyalty had been traded for status. And yet, even in that moment, I didn't wish him harm. I simply let go. By morning, the sun streamed through the curtains, bright and unapologetic. I made myself tea and stood by the window, watching the city wake up. Somewhere downtown, his luxury showroom gleamed under fluorescent lights. Rows of expensive cars waited patiently for buyers who believed money meant power. And somewhere inside that world, he believed he had risen above me. I took a slow sip of my tea and felt the warmth spread through my chest. He thought money had finally lifted him above me. I let him believe it. Before the money, there was us. Not the polished version he would later present to the world, but the quieter one that lived behind closed doors, the one that smelled of instant coffee and warm bread, the one built on routine, not prestige. We lived modestly then, not poorly but carefully. Our apartment was small, with walls that creaked when the weather changed and a kitchen window that never quite shut all the way. In winter, I stuffed an old towel into the crack to keep the cold out. In summer, I tied the curtains back and let the breeze do what it could. He used to joke that the place had character. I knew that was his way of saying we couldn't afford better. I didn't mind. I had grown up understanding the weight of work, the value of patience. I knew how to make little things stretch and still feel full. I knew how to make a home feel safe even when the future felt uncertain. He didn't. When we met, he carried ambition like a fragile thing, held too tightly, afraid it might slip through his fingers. His family had always expected greatness from him, but expectation without support can feel like a sentence. They talked about legacy often, about the family car showroom business that had been passed down through generations, about how one day it would all be his responsibility. "You're the one," his father used to say, clapping him on the shoulder. "Don't waste it." Those words followed him everywhere. On nights when doubt crept in, he would sit at the small dining table, elbows resting on its scratched surface, staring at nothing. I learned the signs, the way his jaw tightened, the way his fingers drummed restlessly when he was trying not to unravel. "I don't think I'm good enough," he admitted once, voice barely above a whisper. "What if I ruin everything they built?" I reached across the table and covered his hand with mine. His skin was warm, familiar. "You won't," I said, "and even if you struggle, that doesn't mean you fail." He looked at me then, eyes searching, desperate for reassurance. "You really believe that?" I do, I said without hesitation. I always did. There were years like that, years where his confidence rose and fell like the tide, and I became the shoreline that stayed put. I listened when his family criticized his decisions. I defended him when others whispered that he wasn't ready. I took on extra work when money was tight, managed the household without complaint, smoothed over arguments, made excuses when he missed events because he was too stressed. I learned to be strong quietly. When he failed a small business venture early on, a risky idea that never took off, he came home furious with himself. He paced the living room, hands running through his hair. I should have known better, he snapped. I make the wrong decisions. I waited until his anger softened into exhaustion, then sat beside him. You took a chance, I said. That doesn't make you foolish. It makes you brave. He leaned into me then, forehead resting against my shoulder like a child seeking shelter. I don't know what I'd do without you, he murmured. At the time, I thought that meant love. Looking back, I understand it meant dependence. I carried more than my share, but I told myself that was what partnership was. One of us strong when the other faltered, one of us steady when the other shook. What I didn't see, what I couldn't yet see, was how that balance began to shift. As the years passed, he grew restless, not with me at first, but with the life we had built together. Modest living began to irritate him. Simplicity felt like a limitation instead of a foundation. He lingered longer in places that glittered, fancy restaurants, expensive events hosted by friends of friends. He came home talking about people who wore confidence like a tailored suit. They just move differently, he said once, scrolling through photos on his phone. They know how to belong in rooms like that, I smiled gently. Belonging isn't about the room. He didn't respond. That was the beginning. He started noticing my humility in ways that made it feel smaller. The clothes I wore, the way I spoke, the fact that I didn't crave attention. You don't have to be so plain, he said once, half joking, half serious. People judge. People always judge, I replied. I'd rather be comfortable, he sighed, as if my comfort inconvenienced him. I didn't change. I didn't know I was supposed to. When his family gatherings became more frequent, the pressure intensified. They spoke openly about wealth, about expansion, about what the business could become with the right leadership. He listened closely, nodding, absorbing every word. They rarely spoke to me. When they did, it was polite, distant. You're very grounded, his mother once said, her smile thin. He needs that. I thanked her, unaware that grounded was already starting to sound like holding him back. By the time the inheritance came, something had already shifted between us. Gratitude had been replaced by expectation. My support had become assumed, my presence ordinary. The money didn't change him overnight. It revealed him. When he received the call confirming the inheritance, his face lit up in a way I had never seen before. Not joy, not relief, power. He walked through the apartment that night like it no longer belonged to us, like he was already imagining something grander, bigger rooms, sharper edges, a different life, and in that vision, I had already begun to fade. I stood by him through every uncertain season. I believed in him when his own family doubted him. I carried his fears so he could stand taller in the world. But by the time money arrived, gratitude had already left, and when it did, it took our marriage with it. When the inheritance became official, he stepped into his family's luxury car showroom business like a man putting on a tailored suit he believed had always belonged to him. The showroom itself was impressive. Wide glass walls, polished marble floors, and rows of high-end cars lined up like obedient soldiers. Chrome gleamed under carefully placed lights. Leather seats smelled rich and promising. Every surface whispered money. He loved it instantly. Loved the way people stood a little straighter when he entered the room. Loved the way sales managers deferred to him. Loved how his name suddenly carried weight. This is my responsibility now, he announced proudly at a family dinner. I'm going to take it to the next level. They applauded. They always did. At first, things went well. He expanded inventory, hosted flashy launch events, posed for photos beside cars that cost more than the apartment we once shared. He wore confidence loudly. Designer suits, expensive watches, shoes that clicked sharply against the showroom floor. Status looked good on him. Too good. The cars became toys instead of assets. He drove different models every week, took friends on late-night rides through the city, spent money like it regenerated overnight. Dinners became extravagant. Vacations grew longer. Nights stretched later. "I deserve this," he told anyone who questioned him. "I've worked my whole life for it." But work was no longer the focus. Decisions were made quickly, impulsively. He ignored advice from seasoned managers who spoke cautiously about cash flow and overhead. He dismissed warnings from accountants who suggested restraint. "We need to look successful," he insisted. "That's how you attract serious buyers." Appearances became everything. Behind the scenes, cracks began to form. Cars sat on the floor longer than expected. Maintenance costs climbed. Marketing budgets ballooned without corresponding returns. Credit lines were stretched thin to fund lifestyle upgrades disguised as business expenses. Investors noticed. Questions started arriving in emails marked urgent. Meetings became tense. Numbers that once climbed steadily now plateaued, then dipped. He brushed it off. "Temporary," he said. "Markets fluctuate." But the fluctuations didn't stop. Quietly, almost politely, the business slipped into debt. No headlines, no dramatic collapse, just a slow, steady bleed. At the same time, far from showroom lights and luxury dinners, I was learning how to live again. After the divorce, my world had shrunk dramatically. Friends faded, invitations stopped. I felt like a ghost in rooms I once belonged in, but I didn't stop. I found work that paid modestly but steadily. I learned how to manage my finances alone. I taught myself things I'd never had time for, skills that built confidence instead of applause. Some nights were lonely. I won't pretend otherwise. There were evenings when the quiet felt too loud, when memories crept in uninvited. But I refused bitterness. I told myself that anger would only tether me to a past that no longer served me. So I chose discipline instead. Routine. Growth that no one could see but me. I downsized my life and discovered freedom in the simplicity. I learned that independence has a sound. It's the steady rhythm of knowing you'll be okay, even if no one is watching. Years passed like that. While he chased validation loudly, I built resilience quietly. I heard rumors about him now and then, through someone who knew someone. Mentions dropped casually into conversation. "He's living big," they'd say. "Always traveling. Surrounded by people." They never mentioned the debt. They never mentioned the late nights spent staring at spreadsheets, the arguments with investors, the pressure that crept back into his voice when deals fell through. By the 5th year, the showroom was struggling openly. Inventory was cut back. Staff turnover increased. Once proud managers avoided eye contact. Suppliers demanded faster payments. He still dressed well, still smiled for photos, still projected control, but control was slipping. Meanwhile, my life had expanded in ways that felt real. I made new friends, ones who knew me for who I was, not who I was married to. I traveled modestly, intentionally. I slept better. I learned to trust my own decisions. By the time 10 years had passed, the contrast was stark. He was fighting to keep an empire standing. I was standing firmly on my own, and neither of us knew yet how close our paths were about to cross again. While he was losing everything loudly, I would later reflect, I was building myself quietly. I met him on a morning that felt ordinary. No thunder, no signs, no sudden shift in the air, just a quiet cafe tucked between a bookstore and a florist, the kind of place where people linger without watching the clock. I had gone there out of habit, carrying a notebook I rarely wrote in and a book I'd already read twice. He was seated 2 tables away, stirring his coffee slowly, not scrolling, not rushing. That alone caught my attention. People who are at peace move differently. When our eyes met, he smiled, not wide, not practiced, just enough to acknowledge me as a person. Not a moment. "Is that book worth reading twice?" he asked gently. I glanced down at the cover, then back at him. "It depends on how much you've changed since the first time." He nodded, as if that answer satisfied something deeper. We talked that day about small things, about weather that couldn't make up its mind, about places we'd loved and places we'd left behind. He listened without interrupting, without trying to impress. When we parted, he didn't ask for my story. He asked for my name. That was the beginning. He was grounded in a way that felt unfamiliar at first, calm not because life had been easy for him, but because he had learned where to place his energy. He spoke thoughtfully, choosing words with care, not urgency. There was no measuring with him, no silent assessment of what I brought to the table, no weighing of my value against his future. He asked what I thought about things. He remembered my answers. When I spoke about my past, he didn't flinch or rush to reassure me. "That must have been heavy," he said once, simply. It was the first time anyone had acknowledged the weight without trying to lift it for me. Over time, I learned more about him, not through boasting, but through observation. He read financial journals the way others read novels. He asked thoughtful questions about systems, patterns, long-term outcomes. He noticed things. At a local market, he'd comment on which stalls were thriving and which weren't, not with judgment, but curiosity. "That one will last," he'd say quietly. "They know their margins." I thought it was just a habit. I didn't know yet that it was instinct. Our relationship unfolded without urgency. We met for walks, shared meals, sat in comfortable silence. When disagreements came, and they did, we handled them gently, without scorekeeping. One evening, I apologized for something small, something insignificant. He shook his head. "You don't have to make yourself smaller to keep peace," he said softly. The words stayed with me. When he asked me to marry him, it wasn't dramatic. No audience, no spectacle. We were sitting at home, the windows open, evening air drifting in. He took my hand and said, "Life feels steadier with you. I'd like it to stay that way." I said yes without hesitation. Our marriage was simple. No loud announcements, no performance. Just two people choosing each other with intention. We built routines together. Morning walks, shared meals, quiet evenings. I felt safe in a way I hadn't realized I was missing. Safe enough to rest. Safe enough to laugh without checking myself. I never asked about his work in detail. Not because I didn't care, but because he never made it central. When he spoke about it, it was with restraint. He mentioned investments, partnerships, analysis. Nothing flashy. I assumed it was stable. I didn't know it was powerful. One afternoon, months into our marriage, he came home thoughtful. "There's a company I've been studying," he said casually, setting his coat down. "It's struggling." I nodded, pouring tea. "That happens." "Yes," he agreed. "But sometimes struggling doesn't mean broken. Sometimes it means mismanaged." I smiled faintly. "You always see things that way." He returned the smile, eyes distant. "Patterns repeat." I didn't ask which company. I didn't know it mattered. Our life continued peacefully. I settled into joy without suspicion, a habit that took practice after years of caution. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I didn't know my past was already on a collision course with my future. The first time he mentioned the company, it sounded like an afterthought. We were in the kitchen, late afternoon light spilling across the counter, dust dancing lazily in the air. I was slicing fruit for dinner, the steady rhythm of the knife grounding me, when he leaned against the doorway and said, almost casually, "I heard about a business that's struggling." I glanced up. "Struggling how?" "Cash flow, leadership fatigue, too much money moving in the wrong directions." He shrugged lightly. "Nothing unusual." I went back to my cutting. "That happens." "Yes," he said, watching me. "It does." There was something in his tone, curious, not concerned, the way someone speaks when a puzzle has caught their attention. He didn't say the name of the company. He didn't say where it was. And I didn't ask. That was the kind of marriage we had. No secrecy, but no interrogation either. We trusted the shape of each other's days. Over the next few weeks, I noticed small changes. He spent more time reading in the evenings, papers spread neatly across the table. Not frantic, focused. Sometimes he paused mid-sentence, eyes narrowing slightly as if something had just clicked into place. "What are you thinking about?" I asked one night, setting a cup of tea beside him. He looked up, smiling faintly. "Waste," he said, "and how easily it hides behind shine." I laughed softly. "That sounds like experience talking." "It is," he replied, "but not mine." I didn't know then that the struggling company he was studying was the same luxury car showroom that once glittered like a crown on my former life. I didn't know that behind the chrome and polished floors, desperation had begun to seep into every corner. What I did know, what I could feel, was that my husband was moving with intention. Quietly, he began making calls. Not many, just enough. Conversations held behind closed doors, voices low, measured. When I passed by, he never hushed me, never stopped speaking. There was nothing to hide from me, just details he didn't want to burden me with yet. One evening, he came home later than usual, not exhausted, energized. "They're desperate," he said, loosening his tie, "which makes them honest." I raised an eyebrow. "Desperation doesn't always lead to honesty." "No," he agreed, "but it reveals leverage." He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. I had learned that when he spoke like that, something was already unfolding. Behind the scenes, the showroom's situation was worse than most people realized. The debt had grown quietly, like mold behind walls no one wanted to tear open. Lavish expenses disguised as branding, loans taken to cover losses, then more loans to cover those loans. Investors were restless, banks were patient, but patience has limits. They needed capital, not a loan, not advice, a savior. My husband saw what others had missed. The brand still had value. The location was prime. The customer base was loyal. What it lacked wasn't money, it was discipline, direction, respect for margins, and leadership that didn't confuse indulgence with success. Negotiations moved faster than anyone expected. He didn't storm in with demands, he listened. He asked questions that made people uncomfortable, not because they were aggressive, but because they were precise. Why did you approve that expense? What return were you projecting here? Who signed off on this? Silence answered most of them. Within weeks, terms were drafted, revised, drafted again. I noticed the tension in the air, the way his phone buzzed more often, the way he smiled to himself sometimes, thoughtful, satisfied. Still, he never brought the weight of it home. One night, as we lay in bed, I asked gently, "Is it a big decision?" He turned toward me. The room was dark, but I could feel his attention sharpen. "Yes," he said, "but it's the right one." I nodded. That was enough. The deal closed on a quiet Tuesday morning. No press release, no champagne, no announcement, just signatures exchanged in a glass-walled conference room, hands shaken firmly, relief flickering across faces that had been holding it in for too long. 80% ownership, control without spectacle. When he came home that afternoon, he looked lighter, not triumphant, grounded. "It's done," he said simply. I smiled. "I'm glad." He studied me for a moment, as if deciding something. "I'm going to visit the company," he added. "See things firsthand." "That makes sense." "Would you come with me?" he asked. The question surprised me. "I don't want you to feel obligated," he said quickly. I like having you with me." I felt a small warmth bloom in my chest. "Of course I'll come." He reached for my hand, squeezing it gently. "Thank you." We planned the visit like any other outing. Nothing dramatic. I chose a simple dress. He wore a tailored suit that fit him comfortably, not loudly. As we drove toward the city, I watched buildings rise and fall outside the window, unaware that the road ahead was leading me straight into a past I had long since released. The showroom came into view slowly. Glass, steel, sunlight bouncing off expensive curves. It looked just as it always had, polished, impressive, confident. I felt nothing. No dread, no nostalgia, just curiosity. He parked the car and stepped out first, walking around to open my door the way he always did. The air smelled faintly of oil and new leather, a scent I recognized but no longer belonged to. "Ready?" he asked. "Yes," I said. We walked toward the entrance side by side, our pace unhurried, our shoulders aligned. Inside, staff moved with forced efficiency. Smiles that didn't quite reach the eyes, conversations that paused a beat too long when they noticed my husband. No one had announced our arrival. They didn't need to. Something was already shifting. As we stepped further into the showroom, my gaze lifted and then stopped. Across the floor, framed by gleaming cars and two bright lights, stood a man I hadn't seen in 10 years, my former husband. He was thinner, sharper around the edges, still dressed well, but the confidence he once wore so easily now looked practiced, fragile. He was mid-sentence, speaking to a manager when his eyes met mine. The color drained from his face. Time slowed, thickened, stretched. He looked at me, then at the man beside me, then back at me again. I felt my husband's hand tighten slightly around mine, not in warning, but in presence. Neither of us knew who we were about to see. The showroom went quiet before anyone said a word. Not silent. There were still engines humming somewhere in the back, heels clicking faintly against marble. But the energy shifted. The air tightened. Conversations thinned out. People sensed something before they understood it. I felt it too. I stood just inside the entrance, my hand resting lightly in my husband's, my posture relaxed, grounded. The lights overhead were bright and unforgiving, reflecting off polished cars lined in perfect rows, red, black, silver. Machines designed to impress, to dominate attention. Once this place had felt intimidating to me. Now it felt small. My ex-husband saw me first. I watched the recognition move across his face in stages. confusion, then disbelief, then something sharper, panic perhaps. His mouth parted slightly like he wanted to speak but didn't know which version of me stood before him. I didn't smile. I didn't look away. I simply held his gaze, calm and unguarded, as if we were two strangers passing on a street. Then his eyes shifted. They traveled slowly, from my face to my dress to my hand, to the man standing beside me. I felt my husband straighten just a little, not out of defense, but certainty. He stood comfortably in his body, his presence unforced, the kind of confidence that doesn't announce itself. My ex-husband's brows knit together. He looked again, once, twice, as if rearranging the scene might make it make sense. He stepped forward instinctively, then stopped. His shoes squeaked faintly against the floor, the sound embarrassingly loud in the sudden hush. "You," he began, then cleared his throat. "What are you doing here?" His voice carried farther than he intended. I didn't answer right away. I turned slightly toward my husband instead, a small, natural movement, and felt his thumb press gently against my hand. A quiet reassurance, not possession. "We're here to see the showroom," my husband said evenly. "Not your showroom, not his business, just the showroom." My ex-husband blinked. "This isn't a public tour," he said quickly, recovering just enough to reach for authority. "You'll need to speak with management?" My husband finished calmly. "Already done." That was when the manager approached. I recognized him vaguely, older now, shoulders slumped under years of stress. He looked at my husband with something close to relief. "Sir," he said, nodding, "we weren't expecting you today." My ex-husband's head snapped toward him. "What do you mean, sir?" The manager hesitated, eyes flicking between us, then settled on my husband again. "I'll gather everyone," he said quietly. My ex-husband laughed once, a short, brittle sound. "There's been some mistake," he said, waving a hand. "This is a private business." My husband met his gaze for the first time. "No," he said gently. "It's a company." The word landed heavily. The manager returned with a tablet in hand, flanked by two executives whose expressions were carefully neutral. One of them spoke, voice formal. "As per the finalized agreement," he said, "we'd like to welcome our majority stakeholder." My ex-husband froze. Majority. He looked at the executive, then at the manager, then back at my husband. "What agreement?" he asked, voice thinning. The executive hesitated only a moment. "The acquisition finalized last week. 80% ownership." 80%. The color drained from my ex-husband's face so quickly it was almost frightening. His lips parted, then pressed together. His hand tightened around the folder he'd been holding, knuckles whitening. "That's not possible," he whispered. My husband didn't raise his voice, didn't step forward, didn't claim space. He didn't need to. "It is," he said simply. The showroom felt suddenly too bright, too exposed. People nearby pretended not to listen, but no one moved. Every eye hovered just out of sight. Every breath held. My ex-husband looked at me then, really looked, as if only now seeing the years etched gently into my face, the ease in my posture, the absence of apology in my eyes. "You knew," he said hoarsely. I shook my head slowly. "No." That seemed to hurt him more. "You didn't plan this?" he pressed, desperation creeping in. "I planned my life," I replied, "not yours." The words were calm, not cruel, but they struck deeper than any accusation. He turned back to my husband, voice rising now. "You can't just walk in here and take—" "I didn't take anything," my husband interrupted softly. "I bought it." Silence followed. The truth settled in layers, each heavier than the last. The reckless spending, the ignored warnings, the desperate search for capital. All roads led here. My ex-husband's shoulders sagged slightly, as if the weight he'd been holding up finally crushed him. "This was my family's business," he said weakly. "And you ran it," my husband replied. "Into the ground." No malice, no pleasure, just fact. I watched my ex-husband's face contort, not in rage, but realization. His eyes flicked around the showroom, the cars he once paraded, the people he once commanded. All of it, no longer his. I felt something inside me settle completely. I realized then, money didn't elevate him. It exposed him. Exposed his impatience, his entitlement, his belief that wealth could replace character. He had lost his marriage the day he decided love was beneath him. And now, standing under the same lights that once crowned him king, he understood he had handed his empire to another man. My husband turned slightly toward me. Are you all right? I nodded. I am. That was the moment my ex-husband truly froze, not because of the deal, not because of the loss, but because I was whole. No anger, no pleading, no need for revenge, just finished. I'll let you continue your work, my husband said to the executives. We'll talk details later. They nodded quickly, already shifting allegiance without ceremony. As we walked away, I felt my ex-husband's eyes on my back. For the first time, he had nothing to say. And for the first time, I had nothing left to prove. The days after that moment did not explode the way stories usually promise. There were no dramatic phone calls, no apologies delivered too late, no public downfall for people to whisper about. Life simply corrected itself. The company stabilized first. It happened quietly, almost respectfully, like a body responding to proper care after long neglect. My husband didn't rush in waving authority. He didn't replace faces overnight or announce sweeping changes. He listened. Numbers were reviewed honestly, expenses trimmed without ego. Managers who had been drowning were given clarity instead of blame. The showroom floor was reorganized, not to impress, but to function. Slowly, confidence returned to the staff. Not the loud kind, the steady kind. Customers noticed. Suppliers relaxed. The bleeding stopped. And my ex-husband, he remained, but not as he once was. His title was reduced. His authority narrowed. Decisions he once made alone now required approval. Meetings he once led were now attended, quietly, stiff-backed, listening more than speaking. I heard this not from gossip, but from distance. The kind of distance that turns news into background noise. I felt no satisfaction in his discomfort. What I felt was release. Because I didn't need him to fall in order for me to rise. I had already done that on my own. We didn't speak after that day, not because there was bitterness left, but because there was nothing unfinished between us. Closure doesn't always arrive with words. Sometimes it arrives with clarity so complete that conversation would only cheapen it. One evening, weeks later, my husband and I returned to the showroom briefly, not for business, just to check on things. I walked through the space without weight this time, noticing details I'd once overlooked. The hum of the lights, the careful alignment of cars, the way the staff moved with purpose instead of fear. This place no longer held power over me. It never truly had. As we turned to leave, I felt his hand reach for mine, fingers warm, familiar. I didn't cling, I didn't tighten my grip, I simply held on. Outside, the city moved as it always did. People hurried past, chasing futures they believed would save them. Somewhere nearby, a car engine roared to life, confident and loud. I stood still for a moment, breathing in air that felt lighter than it ever had. I thought about the woman I used to be, the one who stood in a living room years ago, listening to a man explain why money had made her obsolete, the one who chose dignity over pleading, silence over spectacle. She had no idea what waited for her. She only knew she wouldn't beg, and that choice, quiet, misunderstood, deeply lonely at the time, had changed everything. People misunderstand strength. They think it looks like confrontation, like dominance, like proving a point, but real strength often looks like restraint, like walking away before your worth is debated, like letting someone believe they've won, while you go on to build a life so full it doesn't need witnesses. My husband squeezed my hand gently. Ready? Yes, I said, smiling softly. I am. We walked away together, not hurried, not triumphant, just aligned. Behind us, the showroom doors closed with a muted sound. Not a slam, not a final statement, just an ending. And as we stepped into the evening light, one truth settled in me fully, finally, without pain. When someone leaves you for money, let them. Wealth reveals character faster than poverty ever could. I didn't lose anything that day years ago. I gained my life. I'm really glad you stayed with me. My dear, thank you for sitting quietly and letting me share my story with you. If this story touched you, please show me a little love by liking this video and subscribing to my channel. It truly means more to me than you know. Now listen. My ex-husband once looked me straight in the eye and said I would never reach 1,000 subscribers. He said people wouldn't care enough to listen to an old woman's stories. So if you're still here with me right now, please help me prove him wrong. Just one click can turn his doubt into my victory. And before you go, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Tell me your city and the time it is where you are. It warms my heart to see how far my stories travel across the world. I share new life stories with you every single day, and in just a moment, 2 of my most loved stories will appear on your screen. Go ahead and choose one to keep me company a little longer, sweetheart.